Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show for this week. And World War II and the years that preceded it saw a significant change in views in the USA with regards to alcohol. Lisa Jacobson joins me to discuss this fascinating subject. Her book, Intoxicating Pleasures, which is about the best name for a book that features World War II we've had for a long time on the channel, is, of course, in the links below. There's my copy there. I've nearly finished it, and it made me think about things that I didn't realize I needed to think about until I read it, and it all kind of came together. And I love those kind of books. So I'll bring Lisa in now. Hello, how are you today?
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
And before we bring up the presentation, I always like to ask a new guest kind of how they define themselves: historian, researcher. Is it the social aspect? Because we're going to be talking about the military, but kind of as a secondary aspect to this primary subject. But do you have a label you like to use?
I guess if I had to pick one, I would say I'm a cultural historian, but there are lots of things that intersect with that. So I work at the intersections of social history and politics and business history, popular culture. I teach courses on the history of food, history of childhood, history of popular culture. So I've got my hands in many pots. But I do define myself, I guess, first as a cultural and a business historian. And I came late to military history, but discovered that it's fascinating, especially from the cultural and social vantage point.
Well, that's what what I enjoyed reading about the book is this connection of, it's the tail wagging the dog. Is the consumption of alcohol influencing the military, or is the military influencing the consumption of alcohol, or both, or is it more complicated than that? But I think we all have this idea that kind of alcohol and our attitude to it is kind of fixed. Pubs in Britain have this open since 1653 type thing on there, that this sense that nothing has changed in 400 years. Obviously with the USA, with Prohibition, which I know will come into the talk there, we know there were different eras, but I think there's this sort of understanding that we've always had the same relationship, and it clearly isn't the case. So I'm going to bring up your PowerPoint, and folks, we're probably going to do the kind of big questions at the end of the show today, but obviously far away with anything that kind of comes along, and I will bump in some questions as we go along for Lisa. But basically, I'm going to hand it over to you to take us through this.
Great, thank you. Well, one of the things you'll learn from this presentation is that the United States, of course, has a much more troubled relationship with alcoholic beverages than many other countries. I wanted to start with just a brief overview of the book so you know what some of the larger questions are. When I started doing research for the book, I actually had no idea how central World War II was going to become to the story I told. I started with a deceptively simple question, which is, how did alcoholic beverages, these substances once banned under Prohibition, shed their stigmatized pasts and become widely accepted as ordinary, respectable pleasures? And, in the traditional telling, the story is, well, once Prohibition was repealed, that transformation happened pretty swiftly. And the assumption is that frustration with Prohibition, its lack of enforcement was so widespread, the law was so widely flouted, that when repeal came, that itself was confirmation that alcohol had achieved mainstream acceptance. But that was far from the case. In fact, when the 21st Amendment repealing Prohibition in 1933 returns alcohol regulation to the states, vast swaths of the country still remain dry. So you have something on the order of 1 in 6 Americans who live in states or counties that have some kind of dry law some kind of ban on alcohol. Many of the new alcohol regulations that come in continue to treat alcoholic beverages and drinkers as morally suspect. So after repeal, the alcoholic beverage industry really has its work cut out for them. They have a lot of the stigmas that had justified prohibition still in place. And the task for wine, beer, and whiskey is different. They each have different problems to overcome. So beer and whiskey have to be redeemed from the disrepute of the saloon. Wine has to be rescued from its foreign associations with immigrant drinking traditions on the one hand and with elite connoisseurship on the other. And then you have all of these trade barriers that make it, impossible for spirits to be served in restaurants, or that, make it impossible to sell wine and beer in grocery stores. And the biggest problem, I think, for the industry is that if they're going to win mainstream acceptance, they have to also win over women, because women have been the foot soldiers of the prohibition movement. So they have to worry about not antagonizing women and, in fact, kind of wooing them. So in the end, what I found was that it took a world war and a battalion of advertising agencies, public relations experts, industry lobbyists, home economists, to really transform drinking from a transgressive vice into an ordinary, respectable pleasure. And what's interesting, I think, particularly to this audience, is that the US military also plays a key role in those cultural transformations and political transformations. So what I want to do is take us back to World War I, which will provide some context, and then I'm going to talk about alcoholic beverages on the battlefront, and time permitting, I'll move to talking about alcoholic beverages on the home front. So the stage for the battles to come is really set at the very beginning of World War II, early 40s, before the United States enters the war, when the war really revives the industry's biggest foe, which is prohibitionists. Prohibitionists look at the war and they say, this is our opportunity to stage a political comeback. They have deep memories of what had happened during World War I and what they were able to accomplish then, which was to get alcohol banned, to sort of get massive movement towards a national ban. And so they decide, okay, well, let's see if we can do the same. Let's see if we can get alcohol banned as an emergency wartime measure. And if you look at this first page of an article that appeared in the trade journal Modern Brewery Age, you can see how alarmed the brewing industry is about these developments. They are noting that there are petitions that dries are filing, that dry majorities are now controlling liquor boards. There are things called local option elections that allow municipalities to opt in or out of, to declare themselves either wet or dry. And prohibitionists are still pretty easily mobilized. They have a big base in the Baptist church, in the Methodist church, and those voters are mobilized. They flood Congress with petition drives to get some sort of emergency wartime ban. Now, you'll notice from the title of the Modern Brewery Age article, Deadly Parallel. What's the deadly parallel they're worried about? Well, brewers have a good memory of what happened in World War I, too, and they're worried that, the prohibitionists are going to be able to launch a very similar attack and perhaps be successful. And one of their concerns is that, from their memory of World War I, they remember that prohibitionists had very successfully mobilized anti-German sentiment, and that they're worried that they might do the same thing because the brewing industry in the United States is heavily dominated by German Americans. So let's just take a look at some of the propaganda that was used in World War I that succeeded. On the left, you see this poster, propaganda poster, let's all go clean over to the top clean and keep fit to fight in France for freedom. And the emphasis on clean, has, very clear and somewhat coded meanings as well. I mean, they're talking about let's eliminate all vice, but the clean in all caps, of course, refers to their concerns about halting the spread of venereal disease. So they're going after alcohol. They want an ban on alcohol in the military training camps. They want a ban on prostitution anywhere near the training camps. And you can see from this poster on the right that there's a real sense that if we want to win this war, we need a sober and disciplined fighting force. The other argument that they make is during World War I is that the alcoholic beverage industry is completely unessential, and in fact counterproductive to the war effort because they are wasting grain by distilling it or brewing it that could be better utilized, feeding the troops, feeding allies. And remember, there's a shortage of farm workers. So they really use that food conservation argument to good effect. And in fact, their success is pretty broad. They succeed in getting prostitution banned near the military training camps. They do get a ban placed on whiskey. They get a ban on drinking in and near military training camps. So all of the traditional vices get banned, but one, the military has to offer some sort of compensatory pleasure, and that's where the cigarettes come in. So, and in fact, there are drives to get cigarettes distributed to soldiers. I think the biggest feather in the prohibitionist camp, of course, would be that they get prohibition passed. So there's the Congress has the amendment proposed in 1917, and it goes through the states. And by 1919, they're using all of that wartime sentiment to get it passed, and they get it passed. When World War II comes around, the prohibitionists say, well, let's revive our old playbook and see if we can get that to work again. So their first demand is to create what they call dry zones or moral zones around the military training camps. And this is an incredibly bold demand because the dry zones are 10 miles around. And so if you're in a city like San Francisco or New Orleans, the intent here is not just to dry up the military, but to dry up civilians as well.
There's a good question for you, Lisa. The kind of the prohibitionist movement, is it geographically based? Are people more likely to be pro-alcohol in cities or against cities? I mean, I know a bit of it because I have read part of the book, but for the audience, is there it's kind of a breakdown?
Yeah, there is a breakdown. In the lead up to Prohibition, when it comes in 1920, there's broad support in both. It's predominantly middle class. There's a very strong Protestant contingent. It does appear in cities because that's where the saloons are. And what prohibitionism is about, first and foremost, is an anti-saloon movement. The saloon is seen as the source of corruption, a magnet for all kinds of vice, prostitution, gambling, excessive drinking. But prohibition always has some opposition from, a lot of immigrant communities, Southern and Eastern Europeans, Central Europeans, where there was a vibrant drinking tradition, and the working class, there's fairly strong opposition to it. And in fact, prohibition is selectively enforced and targets African American communities, working class communities, ethnic communities more harshly than others. So when prohibition is repealed, you still find, I think, the strongest support in rural areas, and the alcoholic beverage industry develops very special appeals that are designed to appeal to rural voters and keep them, in the wet column if possible. And you still have, large segments of Methodist and Baptist communities that are real strongholds for prohibition after the war. So you've got the dry zone goal, and then the other argument that they revive from World War I is the food conservation argument. So let's turn to intoxicating pleasures on the battlefront. The US military's response to prohibitionist demands is very different in World War II. I mean, the military had already gone dry in 1900, so they were pretty sympathetic to those prohibitionist demands in World War I. But World War II is the first 20th century war in which the United States military designates alcohol as a provision for the troops, sees it as kind of essential to their morale. So when Congress is getting flooded with these petitions to create these dry zones around the military camps, the Secretary of War, Henry Simpson, says, no way, no how. And the other military officials join him. What they do instead is say, well, let's give our troops 3.2% beer. That's a pretty weak brew. How do they arrive at 3.2%? This is alcohol by weight. So the more common measure that people are familiar with is alcohol by volume. That brings it up to 4% alcohol, which is, the percentage of the lightest beers on the market. When at the time of repeal, there was an effort, very successful one, to get beer re-legalized before the 18th Amendment was repealed. And beer comes in about 8 months before everything else gets re-legalized, in part because there are these hearings in which there's testimony by scientists that says, actually, 3.2% beer is non-intoxicating. You have to drink so much of it that, you're really going to have to work too hard to get drunk. And that becomes a notion that's embraced by the military, by Congress, by state alcoholic beverage control boards. Now, the thing to know about the allotment of 3.2% beer in the Army is that it is pretty limited. You can only buy it. You can buy it pretty cheaply, but you can only buy it in an Army PX. You're limited to 3 12-ounce cans over 3 days. You're limited to 24 in a month. And once you're abroad, there's no guarantee that the supply is going to be there. So supplies were sometimes unpredictable. The preference was to get a local brewery going. And so sometimes they were drinking locally brewed beers that tasted funny to them. one thing that I love, and you see this in the photograph on the left, is that, you know, GIs would store up for what they called a 3 cans per man celebration on, you know, in hopes of, you know, getting a light buzz. And you see this GI who's got 2 beer cans stuffed in his shirt pockets and drinking one. The other thing to keep in mind is that the enlisted man's allotment of 3.2% beer was pretty meager compared to what combatants of other nations were getting. They had their daily ration of rum and whiskey and wine. So in the grand scheme of things, at least on the enlisted man's part, this is a pretty dry army. The real difference comes in what the officers are getting. And this is not something that the Army chooses to publicize, but they have their monthly allotment of 1 to 2 quarts of liquor. In the officers' mess, that's pretty well supplied with wine and cocktails and beer and whiskey. So it's a very wet war for the officers. It's a drier war for the enlisted men. And this becomes a problem. The unequal access to intoxicating pleasures really stokes conflict in the military. You get, you know, this is a segregated military. It really becomes a focal point of racial tension, and it intensifies racial discord in the military. It stimulates divisions between enlisted men and officers. And I think one of the outcomes of these conflicts that's significant is that it really changed how servicemen conceived of their rights as citizens. It prompted some to question how committed the military was to upholding democratic values both at home and abroad. Now, this discord that you see, that I see as a researcher, it's coming up in oral histories, it's coming up in the gripe letters, in Yank magazine, it's in memoirs, it's kind of all over the place. But that's not what the public is seeing during World War II. In fact, there's little hint of this discord in wartime advertising and in mainstream journalism. So here on the left, one of the stock images of the war was the image of the homesick, virtuous, wholesome, beer-loving GI. And the brewing industry takes advantage of that and kind of promotes that image. And you see that in this ad on the left, which is part of their Morale is a Lot of Little Things campaign. You can see at the bottom left a soldier writing home, and the letter is, you see the faint writing at the top of the page. That's the letter in which he's sharing that, you know, I'm dreaming about coming home and enjoying my hammock and drinking some beer. And so the ad really presents beer as one of those small, familiar pleasures that homesick GIs are dreaming about. And this image is kind of echoed in the wartime correspondence of Ernie Pyle, who has a huge circulation. I think his syndicated columns are appearing in 700 newspapers. And what's fascinating about his writing, I was expecting when I started reading some of his columns to see alcohol popping up all over the place, and it really didn't. And I was a little surprised by that. His, you know, writing really depicts alcohol scarcity. You know, sometimes soldiers encounter a windfall of alcohol, but mostly, you know, alcohol is this very small, periodic comfort in their otherwise very dreary existence. And I think that kind of helps to normalize alcohol as this small, ordinary pleasure that makes America America.
I think, and British as well. I mean, I'm thinking of memoirs of British and Canadians. There's so many of them. It's that you know, you liberate a farmhouse and you get that bottle of cider or whatever it would be, and there's a sense of it being part of the process of achieving something in a battle. You know, you've taken a town, you've moved across the map, and then you find that you know, a pub or a bar, you find that alcohol of some sort, and then you share the experience of having it. It's normalizing it. I think that's universal. I mean, even back to the First World War, I remember British soldiers, that idea of, you know, of shared experience.
Yeah, it is normalizing, and I have to say that, you know, when veterans returned from battle in World War I, they were bitterly disappointed that prohibition had been passed in their absence, precisely because drinking was something that was an expected and accepted pleasure. So veterans groups, in fact, were always pretty easily mobilized to defend the alcoholic beverage industry against excessive regulation. One of the lines that I love from Ernie Pyle's writing is that, you know, in talking about the infantryman's dreary existence, he talks about all the velvet was removed from living. And, you know, beer and alcohol was some of that velvet. So he's doing this normalizing. But the normalizing is still revolving around this image of the wholesome beer loving drinker. This is this is an image that's very reassuring to the American public, but it's strikingly at odds with the aggrieved, alcohol deprived, and alcohol seeking GI that comes up in the memoirs, in the oral histories, in the gripe letters, in the cartoons. And historians have interpreted, you know, alcohol's role in the military in a couple of different ways. And, you know, I was expecting something along the lines of what Stephen Ambrose talked about in Band of Brothers, where he writes, every liberated village in France and later in Belgium, Holland, Germany, and Austria was full of wine, cognac, brandy, and other fine liquor of a quality and in a quantity quite unknown to the average enlisted man. And after doing my research, you know, I have come to believe that this is a very distorted view of what they were encountering. Yeah, they may have encountered more alcohol later on in the war, but I think Lee Kennett is really much closer to the mark when he writes that the GI was doomed to see Europe at her worst. Buildings and infrastructure neglected or destroyed, food and alcohol in short supply, and shops closed or emptied of merchandise. So what you have to remember is that a lot of the alcohol has been already confiscated by the German army, or already looted, or destroyed by adulterating it with poisons, or it's been watered down or redistilled into something that's just awful. If you were stationed in the Pacific, you were going to encounter even less alcohol because the indigenous supply is much smaller. And so, in the absence of adequate alcohol provisions, GIs take it upon themselves to provision themselves. And what I discovered, and what some of you probably already know, is that they were very inventive mixologists and distillers. Now you can see that, you know, one mark of invention is to turn to your toiletry kit, and some did this. You can see that Aquavelva was 50% alcohol. If you combine that with some army-issued grapefruit juice marketed during the war as a great supply of vitamin C, you get something that memoirist James Jones, the novelist, described as tasting remarkably like a Tom Collins. There were other more wretched concoctions made by dumping a couple of handfuls of sugar into a 5-10 gallon container of pineapples or peaches or cherries, and that became something that was known as swipe or raisin jack or jungle juice, and it was sickeningly sweet, raunchy smelling, and absolutely guaranteed to give you a hangover.
I'm thinking of the scene in Mr. Roberts with Jack Lemmon and the doctor making the replacement bottle of whiskey. They put iodine in it or something to give it the color, and it's great scene.
Yes, and in fact, even as there are stories in Yank magazine that even as when soldiers got as far as Berlin, there was so little alcohol that what you did find was something that was tinted, with some sort of coloring to make it look like it had substance when it was really mostly water. Now, there's a lot of scarcity of whiskey during the war, both on the home front and on the battlefront, and in part because of that scarcity. And because whiskey was always thought of in the United States as a very masculine drink, whiskey really acquires greater prestige during and after the war. This is what they fantasize about. And in fact, Ernie Pyle writes about soldiers peppering him with questions about how's the whiskey shortage doing back at home, or is there enough whiskey there? Just to give you a couple examples of how whiskey acquires prestige and really enters the fantasy zone of GIs. I found a Black GI who was writing to the Pittsburgh Courier, which was an African-American newspaper, and he facetiously asked Santa Claus to bring him a sweet young Lena Horne type and one large size quart of mild whiskey with 4 roses tied on it, referring to that famous brand, 4 Roses. There was also this robust semi-illicit barter trade that grew up in the Pacific, in which enlisted men would trade war souvenirs to get whiskey, which was, stuffed into every corner of a plane. And when the plane landed, then this sort of barter trade would begin. And, if you had a blood-stained silk battle flag, that would merit something like 3 quarts of imperial whiskey. If you only had a rifle to trade, that might only get you a pint. And if you had nothing to trade, you could spend up to $50 to get a quart of whiskey. That says something about the black market and its prized value. And I think, it's important to remember that the desire for whiskey is shaped by the horrors of war. Men want liquid courage. They also want to forget. And that's I think something that the Army, with their 3.2 erratically supplied 3.2% beer, really probably didn't think through enough, because the desire for alcohol never went away, and this got a lot of men into trouble. Some would drink wood alcohol and get poisoned. Some drank buzz bomb fluid. Some made themselves sick. So
remember a show we did with Alicia Callahan about the 6th Armored Division in their training. I forget where they were training in the USA, but they were pulling in people. It wasn't one of those ones with like a National Guard tradition. They were pulled in from all over the place. It was sort of mid towards the latter part of the war, and they were having problems of people, AWOL, and people getting homesick and not doing the training very well. And so they just increased the amount of alcohol. One of their solutions was to increase the amount of beer they were able to get and make it more accessible. Like, rather than letting these guys talk about it or going to see someone at the chaplain or something and talk about, they just increased the amount of alcohol available, and it was a simple but actually very effective cure. But obviously, long term, maybe not so ideal. But fascinating how they could see it that way.
Yeah, they could. I mean, and they would, and I think the idea behind beer was that, it would have its morale boosting effects, but it was mild enough that they weren't going to get into trouble and get drunk.
Just take the edge off, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, not sure how effective it was in doing that, but they're sort of, that was their idea. They also started imposing curfews to keep them away from alcohol. And there's all sorts of violence, including sexual violence, that results from drunken excesses that the military, is worried about. Now, the inequitable distribution of intoxicating pleasures was really a persistent sore point among enlisted men, among white enlisted men, and among Black servicemen of all ranks. And the number one complaint of GIs stationed in China wasn't the slow mail or the bare PX shelves. It was the monthly stipend of great North American whiskey brands that the officers got. And these complaints surface in the gripe letters in Army newspapers. They surface in the cartoons. So Sergeant George Baker's comic strip, Sad Sack, ran in Yank. And he's, you can repeatedly showing this character, Sad Sack, this bumbling infantryman constantly being thwarted in his, search for women and liquor, either by bad luck or by malicious officers. And you can see in this scenario, a malicious officer has confiscated his precious supply of whiskey, confined him to menial labor while the officers drink his treasured bottle. Bill Malden was also terrific about using his characters, Willie and Joe, to show the enlisted man's complaints about the officers' undue privilege and the infantryman's persistently disappointed hunt for liquor. So on the right, you see the scruffy Willie and Joe, who are on R&R, find that they can't get into the officers' bar because that's only for officers, and they have to, be wearing a tie to get into the soldiers' club. So they kind of throw up their hands. The one on the left was one that for many decades after veterans still adored this cartoon, because I think it captured their experience of thinking they were, going to hit the jackpot only to find that the Germans had beat them to it and the supply had already been looted. So, this line, them dirty, cold-blooded, sore-headed, stinking Huns, them atrocity committing skunks, that really was one that veterans quite liked. Now, Black enlisted men and Black officers had an even more meager supply of intoxicating beverages, and they protested their inequitable access to alcoholic beverages. They were barred, both at home and abroad, from the better bars in town, the better restaurants, the better liquor stores. And if they tried to patronize those establishments, they would meet with violence from white enlisted men. White officers were particularly invested in patrolling Black servicemen's access to whiskey, because whiskey was seen as too potent for Blacks and too prestigious for Black servicemen. When they go abroad, there's really a concerted effort to keep them out of bars in London that white enlisted men and officers might also want to patronize. The Black journalist Roy Ottley wrote about this and some of this reporting was actually censored by the military, but we have his diary, so we know what he wanted to say. And he talked about, white commanders in London who basically told bars, the better bars and hotels and restaurants, that they better stop serving Black patrons, or the military would simply declare their premises out of bounds for all. And I think this is a really important example of how the US military is exporting Jim Crow abroad. Now, all of this racial discrimination that Black servicemen encountered in bars, in the segregated PXs had a much more limited supply, even of 3.2 beer. And the officers' messes, the Black officers' messes, also had a more limited supply. So all of this racial discrimination really has an enduring politicizing effect. During the war, you see Black servicemen launch some sit-ins. You see them participate in some boycotts, very strategic boycotts. They're writing to the Black press in the United States and asking them to publicize what's happening. And after the war, I think it's no accident that Black veterans were, really important members of the NAACP and other civil rights organizations. I think this was such a sore point and a politicizing point because alcohol had become such an expected feature of the good life. It had become such an important symbol of belonging that for both white enlisted men and Black servicemen of all ranks, access to intoxicating pleasures came to be seen as an entitlement of military service and of citizenship more broadly. Now, when you get to the post-war films, I mean, one thing that as a historian I'm interested in doing is seeing, well, how do these ideas and that, and attitudinal shifts that occur during the war, do they have staying power? Do we see them after the war? And how deeply do these new ideas about beer and whiskey and wine penetrate popular culture? And a great example of, I think, the success of the alcoholic beverage industry's own propaganda, as well as the experience of being in the military, that really penetrated popular culture. And you see that, a good example of that, in the Academy Award-winning film, The Best Years of Our Lives, which many in the audience have probably seen, but I'm hoping that you might see one of the key scenes a little differently now that you've heard me talk about this story. So The Best Years of Our Lives is about the experience of, 3 veterans returning and adjusting to civilian life after the war. And you see 2 of those characters, Homer, the Navy petty officer in this still, and Fred, who's a Air Force captain. And Homer has an uncle who runs Butch's Place, a local bar in town. And on his first evening home, he stops in the bar, having told his new acquaintance Fred about it. Fred's there too. And the bartender, Steve, asks Homer, well, what do you have? And Homer, and I hope you watch it because it's such a brilliantly acted.
Oh, it's getting lots of praise in the sidebar. Dave,
great.
one of the best made films of the post-war era. It gets a lot of love here. We've talked about it before.
Yeah. Okay. Well, take another look because this is such a wonderful scene. But Homer says, how many times have I dreamed of hearing that question? Fred, before I went into the Navy, Butch would never let me drink any liquor. He used to read me lectures on the curse of drink, but it's different now. I'm a veteran. Give me a whiskey, Steve, straight. Now, think about how that, how the war sort of deepened the associations of whiskey with masculinity, with dignity, with having arrived, and I think that experience is registering in that comment. Now, that line, those set of lines also do a lot of work that the beer industry would love because, and the beer industry likes what's coming next because it's depicting, Butch as kind of a responsible, bartender or bar owner. So Steve asks Butch, how about it, Butch? Butch says, no, draw beer for the Navy. Homer, very disappointed, says, Butch, I ordered whiskey. Butch insists beer. Homer jokes, I'm going to take my tray to some other joint where I don't have relatives. And I think, when I think about what happened in the battleground, all of those conflicts between enlisted men and their officers over access to whiskey, I think, a returning veteran watching the scene would have either laughed or groaned in recognition that once again, the lowly petty officer is being deprived of whiskey and gets stuck with the beer while the officer, Fred, gets to drink the whiskey.
I guess it also has that thing because they all end up going to Butch's, don't they? Frederick March's wife and the daughter, and that again is that you were saying at the beginning about the idea of the bars earlier in the pre-war being a male domain and a not particularly respectable male domain, and now you've got the bank manager who's a returning veteran and everybody going to essentially a pub and it being sort of okay. It's a little bit, it's not completely okay. There's some look on their faces when they say we're going to, but when they go there, so there's an acceptance of it being an okay environment. Not particularly, it's not a perfect environment, but it's okay now.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, the way, when Homer comes back, one of the first sights he sees is Butch's place, and he says, oh, they've got neon now. And so the bar, in fact, has become a symbol of, modernity and advancement the other character, the banker, I've forgotten his name right for a second. But he also says, now that I can go back to the bar, I feel like I've returned to civilization. And I think, again, that's an association of drinking with respectability, even though, of course, he drinks to excess.
Well, I mean, and that obviously has come up in the sidebar of and we've talked about it so many times on this channel, is the link between veterans returning and some of them drowning their sorrows and an increase in alcoholism and the dependency on it. And that's sort of we will tackle that in other days, but it's obviously central. Before we kind of move on from the legitimizing of bars, I mean, one of the other things I loved about your book is the industry going to war and making it seem that it was an entirely patriotic thing, and the way they talked about trucking and the use of vehicles and tires and how the advertising agencies for the brewers must have been amazed that they kind of got away with it, because it was quite a bold move. So, well, let's try and sell the whole idea of beer, particularly as a patriotic thing. And if you're not drinking beer, you're not helping the country, and it's helping, with the and making up of the byproducts using all the leftover junk from hops and stuff like that they put in rations. I found that really intriguing because I can imagine that initial meeting of these advertisers. We're never going to sell this to half the American public. We're never going to sell them the idea that not only is it an okay thing, it's unpatriotic if you're not supporting the industry. That I thought was an amazing thing.
Yeah, I mean, they really are pretty brilliant about doing this move so that drinking actually is patriotic. And, you know, in that morale is a lot of little things campaign.
Yeah.
Which actually I'll just shift to the next slide, I think. Yeah, here's another example of it. What's interesting about this is, you know, well, beer is just a little thing, one of those simple pleasures, but it's also saying it's kind of up to us on the home front to keep this pleasure going. That's the patriotic thing to do, in order to make sure that those pleasures are still in place when the veterans return. And of course, all of this is an implicit argument against the prohibitionists. This is an argument for don't vote your locale dry. We need to preserve this pleasure for the returning veterans.
And Sean said in the sidebar about, was there product placement or 40s equivalent to promote the glamour of drinking in the movies? And I would think, you know, not so much the movies, but the magazine articles, it's not so much glamorizing it as making it almost mundane. It's like, you know, a beer in the house is as normal as having, you know, powder to do your washing and washing on the laundry outside. It's just part of daily life. And yet the returning GI, whether he's on leave or coming home for good, wants to have normal life, which is filling his pipe, putting his, you know, sitting on the porch in the patio and having a beer. Totally just the mundane but necessary part of life.
That's such a great point. I think, and that emphasis on the mundaneness really comes out in this ad, because it's a bean supper. Yeah. That beer is going with what could be more mundane and simple and ordinary as that. Of course, the bean, you know, supper is a good for wartime meal when there's meat rationing in place. But there's also an attempt to glamorize at the same time. So there's a little bit of tension, but I think there's really an attempt to Americanize and make it patriotic, and associate beer with all of those, you know, mom and apple pie and
kind of reinvent it. You know, you talked about perhaps the immigrant population having a different attitude to beer and wine and things, but say, okay, we've had spirits, we've had wine, we've had beer for decades in the USA, but it's kind of been on other people's terms in a sense. It's the way these countries brought it to us is how we've been accepting it their way. But now this is the time for the USA to define its own relationship with these commodities, and as you say, kind of rebrand it as along with mom's apple pie and the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah, and make it very, very middle class, very suburban, very white, very American. So there's all of that. Absolutely. And I think I'll go to my next slide, because this really speaks to what we're talking about. You know, one of the things that the brewers and vintners do, so their battle is to redeem alcohol and transform it into this ordinary, respectable pleasure. And one of the ways that they do that is to associate alcohol with the values the military was fighting to defend. So this ad on the left is created by a brewing trade association. This is kind of collective advertising. Beer belongs, and look at the picture they've chosen. I mean, they're hiring these brilliant commercial artists. This is a picture of a roof raising, so a little bit of Americana. It's associated with little hint of the rural, the suburbs.
Togetherness.
You cannot get more wholesome than neighbors coming together, the white picket fence. This is Americana. And you're inserting beer into it. You can't quite see because of the smallness of the screen, but you have women who are drinking beer right next to the fence. You have a woman serving and pouring beer. You have beer drinking going on the right corner. And let's look at the copy in the ad, because to say beer belongs in this America of tolerance, good humor, neighborliness, pleasant living. Tolerance is an important charged word in the war, because that's a word that contrasts with the intolerance of the fascist enemy. And then it makes one more move to say the right to enjoy beer is the American heritage of personal freedom. So here's doing another move, which I think is asserting a right to drink. And that's something that really had been pretty muted as an argument in the campaign to repeal prohibition. But this is an argument that World War II brings to the fore. Now, the wine image might seem to be less about the war. You have a little hint of the war with a small pitch to buy war bonds. But here again, when you serve wine, you help everybody to ease up from the strains of the day and be good companions. It's sort of saying, Americans have a lot to do on the home front. You're contributing to the war effort too, but you need to relieve your stress. It's important to keep up morale if we're going to sustain this commitment to the war effort. So go ahead and have a little enjoyment. You've got this multi-generational picture, this beautiful kind of very middle-class dining room. It couldn't look more respectable than that. This must be a special occasion. It's a birthday. Otherwise, they wouldn't be showing the steak, which would have been eaten rarely during the war because it was rationed. But I think this gets at what a lot of wartime propaganda did, which was to say that we're fighting for the protection of home and family and loved ones. We're fighting to protect an American standard of living that includes the pleasures of drinking beer and wine. Now, what I think is the alcoholic beverage industry's most innovative move is to associate alcohol with wartime food crusades. So during the war, the government is constantly reminding Americans that they have to conserve food. They have to obey rationing requirements. So meat, sugar, coffee, butter, all of those things are rationed. There's much more heavy rationing in European countries than American countries, but not wasting food is important so that the troops will have enough, so that the allies will have enough food, and so that the peoples who were recently liberated from fascist occupation can have food. And this is part of what becomes the Food Fights for Freedom campaign. The other thing is that the government has to deal with a scarcity of grain. And grain is scarce in part because so much of it is being redistilled into industrial alcohol. And the whiskey industry's patriotic contribution to the war effort is to convert all of their facilities to 24/7 production of industrial alcohol. They still have beverage alcohol in inventory so they can still sell it, but they're not producing any new whiskey, which is why shortages start to appear. But what's fascinating to me about this story is to think about how food is literally weaponized to wage war. You needed staggering amounts of industrial alcohol to make synthetic rubber. All access to natural rubber supplies has been cut off. But if you want enough rubber to outfit tanks and planes and ships, you just need a staggering amount of it. And the whiskey industry, which has a bit of a public relations problem on its hand because the public is intensely frustrated with whiskey shortages and think that the whiskey industry is deliberately creating that shortage. So they have to come back and say, no, look at what we're doing. We're creating cocktails for the access, smokeless gunpowder. And you can see on the right, this image highballs into rubber, trying to bring down to a quantity that an average drinker could understand. Your highball, we need 100 that you can't drink today. We need 174 million of those daily to meet our daily requirements for rubber. Now, the brewers have a really fascinating way of answering this prohibitionist criticism that brewing is wasting vital foodstuffs. And they say, no, actually, we are ingenious recyclers. We make every grain count. And they define themselves as an essential food industry. And in fact, the government recognizes brewing as an essential industry, and which gives them access to scarce, resources throughout the war. Part of what made them essential industry is that they had to dedicate 15% of their production to the military's supply of 3.2 beer. But this is a fascinating illustration of what happened. So you can see the big barley trucks and coming in, grain trucks coming into the brewery, but even more is exiting the brewery than is coming in. Beer is exiting out, brewer's yeast, which is a byproduct of brewing, is exiting out. That's going to civilian markets, and then yeast and spent grains are going back to the farm for livestock feed. Now, brewer's yeast is the brewer's secret weapon, because what they argue is that brewer's yeast is a terrific source of vitamin B. And vitamin B was the celebrated vitamin of the war. It was sort of hailed as a pep pill. It would boost moods, it would increase productivity, and it could increase, the milk supply of cows and all that sort of thing. And it can be added to food to boost its nutritional value. Once the military figures out how to debitter the yeast, they start adding it into the biscuits. They didn't figure out how to make the biscuits impossible to eat because they were too tough, but the military sort of embraces it, and you can see, this celebration of brewer's yeast as vital to the war effort. It's keeping our defense factory workers in fighting shape. The wine industry has also a fascinating way of associating their product with the Food Fights for Freedom campaign. What the wine industry does, and this is really the work of the California wine industry, which represents 90% of the production. And they say, wine, if you use wine in your cooking, you can turn these drab wartime dishes or your leftovers into something that's absolutely delectable, that's fit for kings. And they're teaching Americans how to use less popular proteins. So this dish on top is oxtail casserole, or on the right you see beans. How serving beans and making that your protein. So it's an interesting move because on the one hand, they're showing how wine can add glamour and flavor and excitement to your meal, but on the other hand, wine is being used to upgrade less popular proteins. But it does. I think this is the one sort of success that carries over into the post-war period. Wine drinking does increase during the war, in part because of all of this effort. And of course, if you cook with wine, you're supposed to drink wine with your wine-infused meal. But wine drinking kind of flattens once whiskey returns after the war. But what does stay is this habit of glamorizing casseroles with a little bit of wine or sherry. That becomes a practice that endures in the post-war period.
It also shows you that the sophistication that the brewing industry had in terms of their advertising, because they'd had to, 2 decades of fighting for even to be accepted by the American public. They've clearly gone for the very, very best, the equivalent today of the Saatchi and Saatchi kind of thing, and gone into this with lots of money. And you said, you talked in the book about they're using the right artists, they're putting them in the right magazines, the kind of the middle class, overwhelming almost the public. They go in loud and strong, don't they? And they're not. This isn't half thought out. They have absolutely. You talk about it. There are committees, and the rival breweries are working together. They're working on it on a broad front, to quote Eisenhower.
Yeah, I mean, these campaigns cost money, and the only way, notice that these are not campaigns that are advertising a particular brand. They're selling the idea of wine.
Yeah.
And of course, they're selling California wine too. But in order to pay for this, you have to get everyone to pitch in a little bit. And, in the wine industry, there was a little bit of reluctance. There was a little bit of arm twisting that had to happen to get that. But they do, and they have the money to pull this off. And this is a campaign, of course, that's supplemented in multiple places, because so the industries aren't doing all the heavy lifting. They've enlisted food and drink columnists writing for Esquire magazine to run similar stories. They've enlisted home economists to come up with recipes that use wine. You have cookbook authors who are showing home cooks how to, make their wartime meals exciting by adding wine, not by the spoonful, but by the half cupful and the cupful. And then you have, recipes that appear in grocery stores that you can sort of peel one off and take home with you. So this is happening on multiple fronts in multiple spaces. It's not just in a magazine that this is happening. And I think that multi-pronged, multi-front propaganda campaign is really what's required to succeed. And I think the fact that so much effort is expended in reinventing wine and beer and whiskey really speaks to, how much work they had to do to reassign alcohol from this category of the transgressive vice and make it respectable. And I'll just conclude by saying that, what I hope you take away from this is a better understanding of how World War II was really this very pivotal moment in alcohol's cultural reinvention. It gave it momentum. I mean, the reinvention of alcohol didn't stop there or end there. It's continually being reinvented. But what World War II does is sort of strip alcohol of all these stigmas so that new meanings can be layered on top of it.
Well, absolutely, and it's been fantastic, Lisa. Listen to this. I mean, I read most of the book, and it's brilliant. But we've got a few comments and questions from the viewers. Many of them you addressed as we went on. Right at the beginning, David K. talked about the temperance movement was still quite active. Pearl Harbor only occurred 8 years after Prohibition's end. Errol, who's over in New Zealand, said that 6 o'clock, the closing of pubs, was a wartime measure in New Zealand, which took decades to remove. Rick Green have related interesting book, can recommend Drunk, How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization by Edward Slingerland. I don't know that book. That sounds really good. There were lots of comments about the alcohol difference between the officers and the enlisted men. And, you know, it reminds me of, we did a show last week. We were talking about the Philippines and Bataan in 1942 there, and how servicemen don't mind being in adversity and suffering if everybody is suffering. But if they think that someone else is getting something they're not, that's a real morale damaging. And, you know, in this particular case, it was the guys defending in the Bataan Peninsula who were eating on, you know, 1,000 calories a day, and yet the people back in Corregidor were on regular rations, and they were, you know, photos and newspapers of them having kind of dinner parties, even though the Japanese are pushing down the peninsula. That really caused problems for the men at the front. And I can imagine, you know, we know you talked about the Mauldin cartoons. He really picked up on that difference, and you examined it about everybody's cold and wet in Italy, but if you're cold and wet but someone else has got alcohol and you haven't got alcohol, it emphasizes that difference. I think Mauldin was genius to pick up on that. And it's almost that the kind of having a go at the officer class, that General Patton got more annoyed about that in some ways than he did kind of the negative portrayal of the army generally. It was more the fact that Mauldin was picking out a difference, which is intriguing.
Yeah, I think that is such a really good point. And, you know, Mauldin, in his own memoirs, was pretty critical of the alcohol's, of the military's alcohol policy. And he basically said, you know, you're trying to run this war as with a dry army. You would be far better off if you emulated what other combatant nations were doing in providing, you know, something like a daily whiskey, rum, or wine ration, because that would keep people, you know, from overindulging and from getting themselves into drinking, you know, poison, which happened.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And keep, you know, people from getting so drunk that they got really violent.
I mean, this is an eternal thing for the military. The soldiers will do things that soldiers will do. They will want to see women. They will want to drink. They will want to play cards. They want to gamble. They'll want to do that. And it's whether if you deny it completely, you just, in a sense, make it worse. If you try and control it and bring it in and organize it, you're at least managing it to some extent. And we've got a show coming up at some point. I was just in contact with Rachel Lance, who did a show about blast injuries earlier this week, but she's got me an expert who's going to talk about the VD problem in World War II and that particular work on what they're doing to go, okay, this is a thing. It's not going to not be a thing. How can we manage this? How can we cope with it? How can we do this? And it's fascinating. We've got a couple more questions though. So Bruce Day is asking, were ration stamps necessary for the purchase of alcohol? That's the USA, I guess.
That's a great question. No, but there is a debate. I mean, it's interesting. Before the war, it depends on what state you're in, because some states have very strict alcohol controls, and some states have, you know, privately licensed liquor stores. Others have state-run liquor stores. And the states with the state-run liquor stores tended to be much stricter. And some of them would keep records of what individuals purchase. So you have the state sort of keeping their eye on what are you up to. But there is no rationing of alcohol, although it's debated, should there be? And it's debated specifically with respect to whiskey, because there are whiskey shortages. And the whiskey shortages create big problems. There's a black market in whiskey. Most of the black market violations are actually done in the liquor store itself, where the retailer will say, you can have that. There's price controls on everything. So there's price controls on whiskey. You can have this bottle of whiskey at the price controlled price, but you have to buy a case of wine to get it. And that was their way around price control is completely illegal. It's a violation of the price control, even while seeming not to. And then there's bootlegging of whiskey. There are hijackings. There are bootlegging rings that spring up. And so a lot of the government agencies, the Office of Price Control, the Treasury Department, get in a debate. What are we going to do about it? Should we ration whiskey? And they really debate it. And some say, yeah, we should ration it. Others say, no, we should just lift price controls and see what happens. And maybe that will increase the supply because the price is higher. But then others, and this is the kind of decision they ended up with, which was, no, can't lift price controls. We need to keep this within the price point of the average buyer, because there's a sense that everybody should have access to this pleasure. And there's no better measure of the normalization of alcohol during the war than the state must intervene to make sure everybody has fair and equal access. But if they don't go so far as rationing, it would just, it's an awkward thing to do because you're rationing a luxury and putting it on the same plane with meat and sugar. They didn't want to do that.
But the argument we're discussing is it a luxury though? Is it? I mean, I'm thinking about in Britain, the Ministry of Food had as many discussions about chocolate as they did anything else, because chocolate was zoned in World War II. And if a particular type of chocolate like Kit Kat got to Cardiff, they didn't want to have so much. One town get one chocolate, and they again, similar thing. They talked about, should we put the prices up? No, because then it becomes a thing that own it. So there were these things that are considered something that you should have available when you want it. When you can't have it available in that way, then you have to come up with some kind of system to regulate it without appearing that you're regulating it in a way. It's a really fascinating study. But the last question for you, and I feel I want to invite you back to carry on this, but Sean is just saying it's another massive, great rabbit hole. But did European drinks and drinking culture get imported back to the USA after World War II? So USA, we've talked about how it goes this great length to legitimize and rebrand, if you like, alcohol in its various forms within the US and with the military. But then all these people coming back from Japan and Germany and France, did that have? I mean, we know about obviously the impact on individual servicemen and having problems with alcohol, but was there a more kind of broad difference that you thought came back?
That is such a great question. This was kind of the question that I started with. And this was my expectation, was that, and in part because it's something that people assume that, the GIs went to Europe, they drank the French wine, the Italian wine, they came back wine lovers, and they brought that custom with them. That was what I was expecting to find. And in fact, that was what the wine industry hoped would happen. And that was their expectation. The US military even goes so far as to create these travel guides to different parts of Europe, and in Paris and in Italy. Those travel guides include recommendations about wines to try and wineries to wine regions to visit. But my findings were that on the whole, that didn't happen. There was a study of a survey of soldiers' attitudes upon returning, and it concluded that they returned much as they went in. Very American in their tastes and their preferences, in their race relations, in their expectations of gender norms, all of that. And it's not to say that it didn't happen. That some didn't develop an affection for wine and come back with it. Maybe the officer class, having more access to it was more likely to bring it back with them. But it didn't happen on that mass scale.
No, I think I agree with you. I mean, I wrote an article for a magazine years and years ago about music, for example, and how the returning GIs actually went back to kind of music they'd been listening to before the war, and actually was quite boring. The kind of, not so much with the, you know, the black population where rhythm and blues is expanding, but you look at the kind of music coming out in the late 40s, early 50s, it's pedestrian. And then you get the rock and roll explosion in kind of the late 50s when the teenagers are rebelling against their dads. But their dads are Wild Bill Garnier, their dads are Dick Winters, their dads are the guys who come back from World War II but want to go back to how it was. And I think the same thing occurs in Britain to some extent. You know, films, music, I think there was a lot of just leave the wine and the experiences of overseas with the uniform they've just discarded, and kind of put that all away and go back. That's my take on it, is there's a lot of that going on. People want to go back to just the years they were deprived, and there's almost a regression in a weird way culturally.
Yeah, I agree.
Brilliant. Well, Lisa, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. I love these shows that we haven't mentioned tanks and aircraft once, which is fantastic.
Well,
folks,
we did mention tanks once.
Did we?
Because remember, you needed that synthetic rubber for the tank.
Yeah, we did mention it. You're absolutely right.
Go together.
Brilliant. Well, folks, I've got a 3-day break. I'm going to schedule an Ask Me Anything for Tuesday. I haven't done it yet. There's lots more shows coming your way. I've been scheduling shows about the liberation of the camps in April. I've got shows about the crossing of the Rhine. I've been working really hard these last few days. As always, buy my guests' books. Here is Lisa's. I've got my copy there. Consider becoming a patron or a channel member. Click like and subscribe, and always support everybody who comes on my channel. So there we are. Thank you, Lisa. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. Thanks for the questions. I will see you all after the break. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.